good idea.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Lois Gaskin, not Paul Watson, as I'm sure you'll realise. I'm the president of the Island Story Gatherers, and I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of the land the Island Story Gatherers are meeting on tonight. The island called Malau, or Phillip Island. We pay our respects to Bunurong elders past and present and to emerging leaders. We extend a very warm welcome to Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us for this event tonight. I also encourage those of you listening in other locations to acknowledge the local Aboriginal custodians of the land you are listening from. And I'd like to thank all of those who are joining us this evening. It's our very first digital event, and we're pretty excited about this, and we've got some two fabulous authors. And just before I do a little intro for them, I'd like to thank Vanessa for all her background work. You can't see her, but she's working there behind the scenes. She's been switching you off and switching us on, and she's just done an amazing job. So also to the rest of the committee, thank you for your enthusiasm in putting this together and your energy and the participation that has come from that. And I'm just really appreciative of what you've done. You all obviously believe in what we're doing. Thank you so much. Okay, now we have Chris Flynn in conversation with Helen Brown. So Chris's third book, MAMMOTH, is going gangbusters at the moment. As Chris said, they're reprinting monthly, and I've had to reorder 4 times, and which is just fantastic. It is funny. It is a little bit sad. It's full of wonderful characters. It's a romp through history. Right from the start, and it's incredibly intelligent. It's fabulous writing. So, and Chris is a local, as you know, and part of our committee. And I just think it's an amazing book. And our other participant is Helen, who has come on, and you've heard them have a little bit of a chat. This is one of Helen's books. It's Cleo, New York Times bestseller. And Helen has done incredibly well with her books. She's got a children's book out as well. And she is a part-time local. And we will have her down soon, probably sometime as a full-time. And she's just a great character, a lovely lady. It's always lovely to have her come into the shop. And her books are fantastic as well. But they're going, Chris and Helen are going to talk in the main about MAMMOTH. So I'll just pass over to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Lois. I'm going to ask Chris, if you don't mind, a few questions. Lois, I just wanted to say, authors love a good bookseller, and you are a great bookseller, and you're the cultural heart of Phillip Island. So please keep doing. I can see someone clapping hands there. Please keep doing what you're doing. It's very precious. And how wonderful that we've got Chris, full-time writer on the island. I know a lot of other people are writing as a hobby and part-time. And it's just a wonderful place for creative people. And let's hope we go forward from that. So Chris, congratulations. This is the most fabulous book. And I laughed and got teary. You must be sick and tired of hearing interviewers say this, but it is just fabulous. But I want to find out a bit more about you and Belfast to Phillip Island. Tell us, how did that happen?
Oh, that's a long journey. So I might as well just tell you, I'm 48 years old. You probably think I'm much younger because of my beautiful skin, but that's a lifetime of staying out of the sun, which is easy to do on Phillip Island, really. It's bit chilly down here. Reminds me of home. So I left Belfast when I was 18. I'd never really enjoyed living there. My parents still live there. They're fairly elderly now. But it was never a place that I grew up during the Troubles. So I was born in 72 at the real height of the Troubles, and never really knew anything else other than having the army on the streets and having explosions every week and people getting killed left, right, and center. That was all I ever knew growing up. I thought that was normal life. And once I hit my teens and realized that's not really the kind of life that I wanted. I was a very creative child, always writing stories. My parents didn't really know what to make of me. I was quite different to them in many ways, and spent a lot of time in the library, and the librarians helped to educate me and introduce me to the world of books and let me into the adult section, let me loose in there when I was fairly young, and would tell me about history books and works of literature that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. But I always knew, it was a bit sad really, because I always knew I was going to leave. There wasn't ever going to be much of a future for me there. So I did leave when I was 18, and I went off to travel the world for basically 10 years. And I lived in France for a couple of years. I spoke very little French when I went there, but I didn't speak English for 2 years. I only spoke French and thought in French and even dreamed in French. And then I made my way south in the world slowly to Australia. So I came here in 99, partly because I was a little bit concerned. I had that premillennial tension that everyone had, if you remember that, where I was a bit worried that the world might end. It's probably more of a concern for us now than it was back then. So I thought Australia is a good place to hide out if the world ends and the Y2K bug gets us all. And I didn't know much about Australia when I first came here, to be honest. I just sort of came a little bit on a whim, but it was instantly very welcoming to me, Australia. It's a country that's been very kind to me, and I have quite a good perspective, I think, on Australian life. I appreciate just about everything that Australia has to offer, and I'm very sort of grateful and thankful that I live here, and never really want to go back to live in Ireland anymore, and lived in Melbourne for most of my time here. So I've been here 20 years, really, just over 20 years. You can probably tell from my thick Australian accent.
No.
But I moved to Phillip Island because apologies to anyone from Melbourne who's watching. I suppose most people are probably locals down here. I got sick to death of Melbourne and decided to move down to the island. And now I never want to go back to Melbourne. I hardly even want to drive up there in the car, let alone move back there. You're probably hankering to move down here too, aren't you?
Yeah, very much so. When did you first feel you could live on the island? When was that moment?
Well, we had been looking to move out of Melbourne, my partner and I, for quite some time. And we knew we wanted to live somewhere coastal, somewhere affordable, somewhere beautiful. And we didn't really know where to go. So we kind of just visited everywhere along the Victorian coast, all the way down into New South Wales, right down to Eden and a little bit further north. And we sort of spent quite a few trips going along the coast, exploring the towns and trying to find a new home, really. And we sort of did it a little bit back to front. We started as far away from here as possible, really. We went right up to Bermagui in New South Wales, and we worked our way back on various trips. And so we looked at the island kind of last because it was the closest one to Melbourne. And then the whole time we're like, oh, it was here the whole time. We should have just moved here in the first place. I had actually never been to the island before I moved here. So those initial trips when we were coming down here to look for, we just rent. So we were looking for a rental property. So we came down quite a few times. And every time I came down, we'd be sitting, on a bench by the beach thinking, do we have to go back to Melbourne now? Can't we just move into somewhere immediately? So it felt like it kind of reminds me of the coastal towns in Ireland. It's got that ruggedness to it, a lot of animals, a lot of wildlife, the open ocean, and it's not heavily populated. You can go, you can walk out of your house and you can get into nature very quickly. And also really friendly people. I mean, talk about feeling welcomed. I think in our first few months here, we made more friends than we did in 5 years in Melbourne, where we always found it a little bit tricky to meet people. And I know my neighbours, which I never really knew them very well in Melbourne. Lois and the Story Gatherers welcomed me with open arms onto the Story Gatherers Committee, and we've had loads of fun getting involved with the festival last year and organising these kind of events. And I'm really enjoying it, I have to say, and enjoying the fact that it's a great place to live as a creative. I'm actually surprised more creative Melburnians don't move here, especially since, we've always worked from home, a lot of creatives, and I'm just waiting for the deluge of people to come down from Melbourne and live here permanently. I guess it's that place where it's a little bit too far to commute, but just far enough away so that people don't come here all the time. It's kind of perfect. Yeah,
it is. And I must say there's nothing like a walk along the beach when you've got writer's block, though you don't get writer's block, do you? I think I saw an interview where you said you don't get writer's block.
No, I've got the opposite problem. I have too many ideas. So I'm quite happy to give away some of my ideas if you want some.
You've had a very varied career. You did a bit of acting, and you worked in a cattery, and we share a love of cats. And we also have a shared thing in that neither of us went to university.
That's right, yeah.
It's quite a timely topic at the moment, with the government talking about doubling fees for anyone who wants to study the arts.
Well, that is interesting to me because even whenever I was younger, I couldn't afford to go to university. You had to pay. And there was just out of the question. I really wanted to go and study acting, but we sent away. My dad was on the dole, so we never had much money. We were a pretty dirt poor Irish family, and so when I turned 18, and I said, I really want to do more acting, Dad. I was doing some in high school, and he said, oh well, let's send away and get a leaflet and see how much it costs to go to acting school in London. And it was ridiculous. It was literally only for the wealthy. Yeah. And the idea of university was, back then, it was for people who could afford it. And so I never really knew anything else other than that. So, it's interesting that Australia's getting to that point where they're trying to make it almost only for those who can afford it. Yeah, I did a lot of acting. I was in an acting group. We traveled around Scotland. I lived in Scotland for a little while when I was young, and we traveled around and did a lot of plays. I loved it, really. I would have loved to have pursued that career, and it probably informed my writing quite a large degree.
I think your great strength with dialogue, it often feels like a play. I can see the characters, and we've got time to talk about that in more depth, because I hope you've all read this book. It's just wonderful, and to hear Chris talk about it, you'll love it. So, do you regret not going to university?
No. I don't. And it's funny. I've been asked in a lot of interviews. I think because it's good. This book delves into history quite a lot, and there's a lot of detail about history and a lot of historical characters. But that was just done out of years of reading and research, and I never felt that a degree was required for that kind of life. But I did an interview with a radio station in WA, and the girl said, so do you have a degree in paleontology, I presume? I said, no, I certainly don't. Well, what makes you think that? And she said, oh, well, you must have a degree in literature at least. And I said, no, I don't have a degree in anything. And she just was stunned into silence. It was live on the radio, mind you. And then she said, but how did you write this book? As if it's impossible to write a book unless you have some sort of academic background. But the thing about writing is, you know yourself, you don't necessarily need to have that formal education to become a writer. There's actually an argument to say that knocks it out of you a little bit, and that it channels you into a very specific type of writing that maybe doesn't have that wide an appeal. I mean, you must have had it too. People must assume that you have got a PhD or something.
Oh no, I don't think they ever thought I was that clever. But but I wonder if not going to university, and that doesn't mean you don't have to hone your craft, because just because you can write the alphabet, it doesn't mean you're a writer. You still have to have the humility to actually learn the craft. So I wonder if it gives you a very different perspective, which means you've got something fresh to offer, which I sense in your writing, Chris.
I do wonder that a little bit. I can see people in the literary scene looking at me funny sometimes because they're not quite sure what to make of me, because I didn't go to Melbourne Uni. I don't have the degree, and they're so used to the only people they know who are writing books are coming out of those writing programs. But obviously what I do is a little bit different. I mean, I'm already a little bit of an outsider because I'm an Irishman who...
that accent doesn't help.
Yeah, that's right. It's a bit obvious. I'm already the person who...
They would be so jealous of, how many 4 print runs in as many months. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Yeah,
I mean, like I think books and literature is a broad church, right? And there's I kind of love reading very widely and all sorts of different types of books, and people from different backgrounds have written books. I don't want to read the same thing all the time, but I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of just reading in your comfort zone and only reading the same kind of book all the time, and feeling like that's the only way it can be done. But I'm being asked quite a lot now to give advice to upcoming writers, and I don't know if they necessarily want to hear what I have to say, which is you don't have to go and do a degree in it if you don't want to. If that's not you can still go off and have a job. And I've had dozens and dozens of different jobs in my life, and I was always writing in my spare time and in the evenings, and trying to use the experience that I gained in the different jobs I had to improve my creative practice.
So where actually did you learn your craft? Are you completely self-taught?
I probably am. I don't remember anyone ever showing me what to do. If anything, the teachers that I had in high school were holding me back a little bit. My English teacher, he was a bit of a bastard. We all kind of hated him because he was so smug, and he thought he was the smartest guy on the planet, and none of us liked him. And he used to give me 0 for my creative writing assignments.
Wow.
Because he would say, he'd give a title. I would write a story based on the title, and he would say, "No, you've misunderstood the title." I thought that was the whole point of creative writing, but was to be creative. But so he wasn't very supportive at all. Quite the opposite. Whereas my history teacher was a really nice man, Mr. Gardner, and his nickname was Nookie because he looked a little bit like Nookie Bear. I don't know if people remember Nookie Bear, but Nookie Bear was a ventriloquist dummy that an Englishman called Roger de Courcy, I think his name was. And he had this ventriloquist dummy called Nookie Bear, and my history teacher just looked like the ventriloquist dummy. And so
was this the beginning of your interest in old bones, Chris?
It probably was. A combination of Mr. Gardner and his very sort of quite glib, funny alternative way of teaching history, and looking at history with sort of through humorous eyes. Everyone loved his classes because they weren't boring. He would tell jokes. He would, go down little side alleyways, and not just teach exactly what was on the page in front of him. And so that was probably quite formative in my interest in history. And I've been thinking about him a lot since this book came out, and wondering if subconsciously he had a big influence on it. And then going to the library, and the librarians also directing me towards history books. I always had a bit of an appetite for it, but never really knew how to channel that into my writing. And even when I was researching this, I could sense there was a novel there, but I couldn't really work out exactly what it was going to be. I knew I was enjoying reading the history books and the stories behind the characters and the events in this book, but I didn't really know how I was going to pull it all together.
So was this around the time of this very famous auction, or is this before then? This is you just looking at old bones, basically.
Well, I always loved bones, and that sounds silly, but like I was always begging my parents to take me to the Natural History Museum in Belfast and look at the dinosaur bones. I think we all a bit like that as kids, though, aren't we?
And did they speak to you then, the bones?
Yeah, I still have very fond memories of being a kid and going to the museum and seeing the dinosaur bones and the mammoth bones in the museum, and buying little plastic dinosaur toys and just loving that world. It was a world of great, imagination and escape for me. And it is a bit of a challenge when you're a kid, when someone tries to explain to you that, mankind weren't always in charge on this planet, that there were creatures that lived here long before us. And that's a bit of a funny thing to get your head around as a kid, and it probably still is a little bit. So the auction in 2007, that was sort of piqued my interest a little bit more, because
I wanted to ask you, do you remember where you were when you first heard about it? Because it was probably quite a small news item.
It really was. I think I was on the internet looking at something else, and it just popped up, and I was probably looking up Nicolas Cage, the actor, because I'm a bit of a fan. And then I saw that he had just bought a Tyrannosaurus skull at a natural history auction in 2007 in New York, which is the opening point for the book, really. A real auction where they were selling the bones of dinosaurs, megafauna, sharks' teeth. They had the severed hand of an Egyptian mummy, a prehistoric penguin. All sorts of weird creatures were on sale at these auctions. And these auctions are real, and anyone can go and you can put in a bid. And usually museums buy up the exhibits, but increasingly celebrities in recent years have been bidding for them because they want a dinosaur bone to put on their wall or put in the foyer of their mansion and show off to their friends. And Nicolas Cage and Leonardo DiCaprio fought over the Tyrannosaurus skull. And Nicolas Cage ended up spending $276,000 on it.
I had to do a bit of research on this, Chris, and apparently Nicolas Cage is a bit of a hoarder. And that year he bought 3 houses and 22 cars. Has he got a problem?
He actually had to sell a lot of his stuff because he ended up broke. I think he had so many houses, so many cars. Some of the houses, he wasn't even living in them. He had all these dinosaur bones and everything else in there. But he ended up having to sell it all. And that's why he does so many crap movies these days, because he needs the money. So that was a bit of a starting point for me. I thought, oh, what a curious, funny thing that is this auction for bones. But then separately to that, I had read about pretty much the same time that President Thomas Jefferson he was a great corresponder. He always wrote letters, and there was a new batch of his letters was released about 10 years ago. And in those letters, there were some really some real curiosities where he talked to people, asking them to go out to the wilderness and try and find him some mammoth bones. And this was 1800, just after he'd been elected. And he spent that first year in power poring over mammoth bones in the White House instead of doing his job. Of course, Republican presidents never change, do they?
Well, at least he wasn't playing golf.
Or just sitting there eating burgers, watching Fox News. But he was doing the equivalent, I guess, back then, and he was accused of being of not taking his job seriously and concentrating on policy. So I thought, oh, that's really funny that back then these powerful men were commodifying the bones, and they're still doing it 210 years later. And that's when I thought, there's maybe a bit of a link here, a good story to be told. What story would these bones tell us if these animals what story would they tell us if they could speak? And so the premise is essentially the night before the auction, all of the animals are talking to each other. We can't hear them, but they're telling each other the stories of how they died all those years ago and when they were dug up and what they've been doing ever since.
Those voices are so powerful on the page. How did you discover them?
Yeah, it was a funny thing, really. I was a bit worried as to what the voices would sound like when I realized the animals are going to tell this story. I thought, well, what on earth do they sound like? How do you give a voice to a 67-year-old, million-year-old tyrannosaur, or a 1 million-year-old Antarctic penguin, or the mammoth himself, who's about 10, 12,000 years old, or the hand of the Egyptian mummy?
Yeah.
How, what sort of voice would they have? And then I realized that the voice should probably be related to when they were dug up, because the premise being that they're dug up, their spirit, or whatever you want to call it, is above ground. And so they're learning English from the humans or other languages that they hear being spoken around them. And so the mammoth talks a little bit like a very sort of pompous early 19th century American gentleman who's quite full of himself.
Oh, but he's so lovely and sad and wise.
Yes, he's got, he's had a strange life, and it is a bit sad for him. Whereas the Tyrannosaurus was only dug up in 1991. And so I thought, well, and he spent his time in a warehouse in Miami. So I thought, well, he'd probably speak a little bit like a teenager from the 1990s. And the penguin spent most of his life hanging over a bar in Boston. So he speaks a little bit like a Bostonian.
Just brilliant. Really clever. So did they sort of haunt you in the night, these voices?
A little bit. The mammoth came to me first. I think I had done a lot of research and I was pretty much ready to start the book, but I was a bit nervous. But the whole time during the research, it was like I could sense this creature standing behind me in the room, looming over my shoulder, observing me and
I can
nodding.
See him now. I can see him now.
Can you?
Just don't turn around.
And he was nodding and saying, okay, yep, you're doing well. Keep going, keep going. And I wasn't sure how he would start to speak. And as you know yourself, when when you live a creative life, you can't really predict how and when it's going to hit you. And it was all very inauspicious. So it wasn't like I sat down and said, okay, it's Monday, 9 a.m. I'm now going to begin writing this book, because that never really works for me. It was, it was a Wednesday afternoon, 4 o'clock, just about to stop for a cup of tea. And all of a sudden I could hear the mammoth voice and I started writing it. And the first 5 pages of the book came out, over those next few hours. And I was just going along for the ride. And all of a sudden there was 1,000 words and I could see, and it was in the mammoth's voice. And I thought, oh, well, that's pretty interesting. Look at that. I wonder if I'm going to go on from here. Those first 5 pages, we virtually didn't touch them. The editor the 2 editors pretty much left them alone and said, they seem to be just perfect. And we went on from there, and it was a real roller coaster ride from that point on, as the other animals then started to drop into my head, and I could hear them all. I can still hear them, to be honest. I can still hear them today.
Make a wonderful film. I kept seeing it visually as well as, hearing it like that. So how long ago was that, Chris? Were you living on the island when that happened?
No. By the time, it was about 4 years of research where I didn't write anything. And then once I started writing, it was probably about 2 or 3 years ago. So I was working at the RSPCA at the time, in the cattery, as you know. I worked for 5 years at the RSPCA in the cattery, looking after sick and injured cats and kittens, and also cats with behavioral issues who didn't trust us 2 legs. And so long-termers who were in the shelter for quite a long time. And that had really helped me, because once I started to hear the voice of these creatures in my head, I think it was a little bit related to the work I was doing on a daily basis, because I felt very conscious of the personalities of the animals and their complex internal life and the way that they communicate with each other and with you know, with us as humans. Particularly because the animals we were dealing with had, you know, were in the shelter sometimes for several years, you know, for various reasons. And so that really helped me. And yeah.
Do you think we underestimate animals?
I often think animals are smarter than us, and they're kind of observing us and rolling their eyes and wondering when we're going to get our act together. We do have a bit of a vexed relationship with the animal kingdom, I think, as you know, everyone on the island here knows all too well. You know, we basically live in the middle of a nature reserve, and we, you know, a lot of us try to be respectful, but not everyone maybe is as respectful as they could be to the natural kingdom that we have the honor to live amongst. I think generally ever since we stopped dragging our knuckles on the ground, although some people still do drag their knuckles on the ground. Ever since then, we've basically not had a very harmonious relationship with the animal kingdom. I think we have preyed on them. We've used them for our own purposes. We've wiped a lot of them out. And I think it's probably been pretty naive of us to do that, because we've hurt ourselves in many ways in doing that. And that's one of the things the book's about, you know, these animals that are gone, that are extinct. And there are, you know, there are teams around the world right now working on bringing them back to life, on bringing them back from the dead, and they've got viable DNA. And
yeah, how do you think that's a moral thing to do?
The morals and ethics of cloning is not something that has probably been discussed enough, because it's upon us. A version of Jurassic Park is actually right around the corner. There's already an area of Siberia that's been set aside called Pleistocene Park, and it's been returned to the conditions of thousands of years ago. It's a massive area of Siberia, private land. And there's scientists working there, and they're releasing the animals that used to live, you know, in these conditions, and they're ready. They're all set up for creatures like the mammoth to return. And so when these three teams around the world, in Harvard, South Korea, and China, who are pressing ahead pretty quickly with this, they're going to bring back not just the mammoth. We will see baby mammoth within a year or two, guaranteed. But we will also see the dodo, the passenger pigeon, the Tasmanian tiger. They've got DNA for all of these creatures, and they're going to bring them back, whether we like it or not, whether it's the right thing to do or not. But that's the scientific community to a T, really. Sometimes they will do something because they can and not stop to think about whether they should. And of course, we'll all be in, you know, terrible two minds about this, because we will be able to see the value in bringing in correcting our mistakes, and bringing back some of these creatures, and it'll be irresistible, you know, wanting to see them. But at the same time, what are we doing here? You know, what are we actually doing? And we're not creating new life. That's the other strange thing about this that's not really discussed very much. We're bringing back old life. So the mammoth that will be cloned back to life, these are creatures, actual specific individual creatures that died, and we're going to resurrect them. And they're going to be little baby mammoth, and they're going to grow up and be, you know, shepherded by African elephants, and then eventually, when they're adults, they'll have a herd of them, and they'll breed naturally and release them in the wild. But the crazy thing about that is that these are creatures that already lived, like specific creatures. And
so do you think they'll have a memory?
That's what fascinates me. This idea of, like, will they be able to remember the last time they were here? Will they dream about the last time they were here 10,000 years ago? Like would we, if we were cloned back to life, if we died and then 70 or 80, 100 years from now, we were cloned back to life, would we remember our previous life? It's unexplored. This is the frightening edge of synthetic biology and human development. We're basically reaching this point. We've got so many problems in the world, and yet we're pushing really hard against the borders of ethics, morality, and science, and we're not going to stop. There's enough money and people around the world just forging ahead with this that we're not going to be able to stop it until it's too late and Pandora's box is opened, and we don't know how it's going to affect the ecosystem or the world we live in.
There's just so much I have to thank you about with the book. It got me Googling all sorts of things, and it brought the past alive. And I didn't realize there was a Cape Patterson claw, which was the first dinosaur bone found in Victoria. And I wonder if that will be brought back to life one day. I think it's in the Victoria Museum, in the Melbourne Museum, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. That's just down the coast here. It's ironic that I live here because just down, the coast around Cape Patterson and Inverloch, these are the biggest dinosaur deposits in Australia, which strangely, Australia just has not really had the amount of dinosaurs discovered in the ground that other countries have. We've got relatively few fossils are actually dug up here. Imagine if we could recreate some of the creatures that used to live in Australia, like the giant scorpion that's the size of a dog. I'm not sure we'd want that one back.
Yeah. You see, your book made me laugh, and so many people laugh at a time when we've so desperately needed it. And in my eyes, humour is one of the highest art forms. But I think you and I share a view about Australian writers who really don't think their writing is art unless it's very serious and morbid. But if nothing else at this time, we know how important it is to laugh and to. So where do you think your humour comes from?
I think partially it's that Irish thing where I can't really, talk about anything without making a joke. But, and the Irish will joke at funerals. But one of the things I loved about Australia when I first came here was that it reminded me so much, the people reminded me so much of the Irish, in that Australians, I think they're quite similar to the Irish in that we don't take ourselves too seriously. Generally in daily life, we're constantly trying to make each other laugh, constantly bantering with each other. That's pretty much everyone I know or have ever met in Australia. So I'm always a bit surprised when I read Australian literature and it's so deadly, deadly serious and grim. And, if you came here to Australia and you didn't know anything about the place and you wanted to, and you basically said, I'm going to pick up all of the prize-winning books from the last 5 years and read them, and then I'll get a good sense of what Australia is like, you would think this was the worst place in the world. You would think this was the most miserable, broken country on earth. Whereas for me, it's, yes, we have our problems, but nothing in comparison to Europe and America, So I think I just like to see a bit more humor in Australian fiction, or the humor that we find in daily life in Australia. I'd like to see that reflected a bit more in books and film in Australia. I just can't help myself. And I'm kind of glad that I have written a lighthearted book that's come out at this particular time. A lot of people said to me, "Oh no, what a disaster. Your book you've just spent 6 years working on is coming out in the middle of a pandemic. Bookstores are closed. You're screwed." But it's actually really found an audience. And I think maybe people are appreciating having a bit of an escape and a little bit of humor. And I'm glad that the book's out now. I'd rather it was out now than out, during normal times. Because who wants to throw themselves into more misery in their reading?
I think also it gives you a perspective on life, on history, and it pulls you back instead of just worrying whether you've got enough toilet paper. And I notice they're starting to carry that around again, to realise that we're a tiny part of a huge, great story. And you're very generously and cleverly sort of brought us into that. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book's doing so well.
Well, I also think with things like history and topics, awkward, difficult topics that we face as a species, like extinction, appropriation, and racism and climate change. These are all things that are talked about in the book, and these are topics that are very important for us to confront. But we have a tendency to lecture people about them, and I don't know if that's the best approach to getting through to people. And I've tried to avoid doing that in this book and just present things in a more humorous way. And I think especially with things like climate change, it's too easy for people just to switch off and say, oh, I can't be bothered with this, and probably not the best result, really.
What has COVID done for your creativity?
Yeah, we've talked about this, haven't we?
I'll show you something first. You introduced me to the best COVID dish. I went to see Chris on Saturday, and he gave me this fabulous stuff. It's Snickers bars by Donna Hay. So I've made them, and it's beautiful. Couldn't resist.
And they've got no sugar in them either.
No, they're fabulous. Dates and peanut butter. So my creativity's gone into cooking mainly. But have you been working and writing?
I've been cooking. I've been baking. I haven't been doing an awful lot of creative work. I can't. I mean, I think everyone just assumed that creatives, writers, artists, and everything would be going gangbusters during this time, just writing the great novel or, doing lots of painting. But I don't know if people are. I don't find the general atmosphere of life under COVID to be very conducive to creation. Just because you have time and space on your hands doesn't mean you're going to necessarily, write a masterpiece or paint a masterpiece. I don't blame anyone for just not doing anything creative at the moment. I think a lot of people are probably finding it quite difficult to focus. It's kind of hard whenever the temptation is to open up, news page on your computer and have a look to see, if people are panic buying or how many people got COVID today. And, it's much too consuming in our lives to be able to think about creating stuff. I'm trying, but I don't know if I'm succeeding really.
Well, maybe 200 words a day or something, just anything, to keep. Seems to me you've got more creative flow than I do anyway, you're just...
You've been a bit paralyzed by this, have you?
Well, I was for the first month or so, and then I've actually got work going now, so it's quite nice, some kind of flow. But yeah, I think the atmosphere of the streets and so much anxiety, and you just, it's hard to let go of all of that and go into another world and write something that you hope is helpful. About the only thing I was able to do was read to my cat Jonah on Facebook every morning, and people actually like that. And I think people just wanted reassurance and a bit of lightheartedness. So I still do that every Friday morning. But yeah, I mean...
I have to say, one of the things about living under COVID-19, living under COVID-19 on Phillip Island is a lot better than living under COVID-19 than just about anywhere else in Australia, I reckon.
In the world.
In the world, that's right. And this whole region down here, we're hashtag blessed, and that we haven't really been hit very hard by it, and you can also, walk out your door and go for a walk around Cape Woolamai or something like that, and it just grounds you a little bit, and I think maybe an awful lot of perhaps city dwellers lacking a bit of perspective about the situation and get a bit caught up in it, and it's a bit easier for us down here to sort of have a bit of perspective on it and be still connected to the world that a lot of people probably feel very disconnected from.
Yeah, and there's that lovely sense of community that doesn't always exist in the city.
No, that's right. Yeah.
I was wondering what Mammoth would say, because he's definitely listening into this interview.
I think
What
he
do you
is.
think he'd be saying about us and humanity and the state of the world at the moment?
He would probably say we deserve it, but we deserve what we're getting. But he has a very dim view of humanity. He's been around for 12, 13,000 years, and been above ground and below ground, and been bought and sold and traded and taken all around the world, and is by humans who've dragged him around to put him on display in France and Philadelphia and Ireland. And he has his favorites, of course. He has, some humans that he becomes fond of because they, are outsiders a little bit like him. But he generally doesn't think much of us, mainly because being around for 10, 12,000 years, he can see that we keep making the same mistakes again and again. And I think he would appreciate it if us humans would start to learn from our mistakes and think about getting our act together to take better care of the world and each other, and because the whole idea of holding dominion over the natural kingdom, which we have this terrible tendency to think that we're in charge of everything, that it's all ours, this idea of ownership, it hasn't worked out very well for us. And that's, quite a strong theme in the book, this idea of ownership that is very uniquely human. I think at one point he says, no animal ever tried to own another animal except to eat it. And that's a bit of a mistake that we make. We forget that we are animals and that we are just one part of an ecosystem, and a pretty aggressive one at that. I think he'd rather we have a bit more of a friendly relationship with the world and appreciate what we've got.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I think we've done it. Well, we've done over 40 minutes.
Have we? Oh.
20 past 8. Who's the boss?
I'm just looking at the chat here. If anyone wants to ask questions, there's a chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You just move your mouse down and it comes up with little options, tells you participants, chats, share screen.
I
So
wish
I chat.
Could share some of this beautiful Snickers bar.
Just hold it up to the screen and I'll take a bite. Someone's got their hand up. Oh yeah, Lois has asked a question about Moses. Right. Moses Williams, who's a character in the book. So Moses Williams was a real man who lived in Philadelphia, and he was one of the men who was responsible for reconstructing the Mammoth when they dug it up in 1800, because people didn't really know what it was. They found all these bones in a farm outside New York, and they knew that huge animals had once roamed the plains of America, but they didn't really know what they were. So the initial name for it was the incognitum, the unknown. They didn't really know what it was. They worked out that it was some kind of huge elephant. And so they tried to reconstruct it from its bones. And Moses Williams was actually a slave who belonged to ownership. There we go again. Who belonged to Rembrandt Peale, who was a portrait painter who financed the digging up of the bones. And Moses was a very intelligent man who basically put the mammoth together, and then went on tour with it to Europe to show the French that America had these big creatures. But once he went over to France, the French treated him like he was a moron because he was black. They just assumed that, so because scientific racism was a real thing in France at that time, they basically thought that that humanity was divided into three races, the Caucasian being the superior one, the Mongolian and the Ethiopian. And they kept calling him an Ethiopian. And he kept saying, well, what are you talking about? I'm not from Ethiopia. I'm from Philadelphia. But they just would not believe that he could actually be a man of intelligence and wit. And that sort of idea of racism really permeated the scientific community at the start of the 1800s. and unfortunately lasted for many years after that, and still today people probably think that nonsense. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about in the book, was the origin of these kind of harebrained ideas that humans often have. I mean, there's also a little talk about the origin of human influenced climate change as well, because we turned up and killed all these animals who were keeping the world cold. So I've basically gone back to periods in history where some of the modern concepts that we were talking about all the time kind of began.
I found it fascinating that the mammoths actually helped cool the earth. That just seems incredible to me.
Well, there were tens of millions of them, and they wandered the north of the globe, which was, I mean, as we all know, the continents weren't always the way they are now. And it used to be, you could basically walk around the entire north of the world, which is what the mammoths did. They just encircled the globe, and it was the Earth's refrigerator. So the ground was cold and hard, and because they were so big and strong, they just kept the ground cold and hard by stomping down the snow. And so that's why there was the Ice Age. And once we killed them all, then they weren't doing their job anymore. And so all the ice melted and everything got warm. And so that's the origin of climate change 10, 12,000 years ago. Obviously, it's accelerated with the Industrial Revolution in the past few hundred years. But that's one of the reasons why they're cloning them back to life, is so that they can re-release them and they can do their job again. The notion being that if we can build a herd of mammoth, unbelievably, and release them in Siberia, that they might stomp around and cool the earth down again, and at least try to arrest some of the melting of the permafrost. It's a crazy idea, but I kind of love the fact that there are people out there trying to come up with left field solutions to contemporary problems by looking at the past and seeing what mistakes we made, thinking, oh, maybe if we fix that, we might be able to help ourselves forge a better future. I mean, whether it'll work out or not, I'm sure it'll all go badly wrong, but at least people are giving it a go.
And you are an optimist, aren't you, Chris?
Yeah. Yes, I am. It's unusual for an artist.
I know, and you say some pretty scary things. I mean, what do we do when we wake up tomorrow morning to make the world a better place? What do we do?
Well, I think we're going to rely very heavily on the younger generation because we've generally made a mess of things, and we're probably raising a generation of young people now who may not, unfortunately, be able to choose the life that they necessarily want. They'll have a lot of responsibility on their shoulders for cleaning up messes and solving problems that we and our previous generations have created. I think we'll become very reliant on young people as they become adults, and we're going to have to cross our fingers and hope that they're very smart and very capable and good at solving problems and fixing messes. But at least they are quite engaged politically and socially, a lot of young people. So that's quite heartening to see, I think.
Yeah. Are there some more questions? Yeah. Oh, do you see any of these questions, Chris?
I see one. The Brett.
Yes.
That is the mayor, of course.
Do you think your life journey is a better schooling for your writing than a uni degree would have been? Yes. Yes.
The answer is completely yes. I mean, the old University of Life thing that people used to say, I inadvertently lived it. It's not like I was living a life. I guess I was kind of living a life intending to be a writer. I got very good advice when I was quite young. When I wanted to write books, and someone said to me, yeah, don't worry about that. Just go and live for a while, and then you can worry about writing when you're older. I mean, the average age of a first-time author is 42. And so a lot of people do not begin to write books until they're a bit older in life, middle-aged and older. And that's probably a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, but it's just because whenever someone's young and they have a book out, they get a lot of press and media because everyone's so excited for them. But it's actually quite rare to be published whenever you're in your 20s or even in your 30s. My first book was published, I was 40. So I was, not far off the average. And I couldn't have written any of my books unless I had led the life that I did. And if I had just gone and, studied writing, I'm not sure whether it would have, kicked the stuffing out of me and maybe broken my sort of natural creativity. I've got, not everyone agrees with this idea of, not necessarily going to uni to be creative, but and it's a controversial sort of topic, I guess, at the moment. But yeah.
One who says, what's the one piece of advice you have for young writers? Maybe something you wish you could tell your younger writer self, says Liv.
Yes, I would say don't be too disheartened if you don't get what you want straight away. We do live in a bit of a society that wants instant gratification, and I certainly get contacted from younger writers who've written stories, and they kind of want to jump straight to the top of the tree. But it's a really big tree, so don't expect to just go straight to the top branch. Like any profession, you basically have to earn your stripes, start out small, work your way up. You can't just expect to, come turn 18, leave high school, and suddenly become prime minister. There's a lot of interim steps you have to do. Just like any profession, creativity is the same as anything. You need to practice your craft over years and years and years. Keep trying. You'll be knocked back a million times, but if you've got that fire within you, then you got to just keep going. Keep going is a good piece of advice. That's what Winston Churchill said, wasn't it? When you're going through hell, keep going.
And keep learning, I think.
You got to have an open mind and read a lot. If you want to be a writer, you got to read a lot. You can't be ignorant of what's out there. You got to see what your contemporaries are doing. You got to be quite aware of what's going on in the world. Be quite in touch with things. You got to be an observer, a reader.
Be curious.
You have to have a curious mind. I mean, if you want to be a writer, you probably already have a curious mind. So you're already off to a good start.
Yeah, and I think storytelling, method of storytelling, that we always will need stories. We've been needing stories since we were in caves, and we may not be telling stories between covers in 25 or 50 years' time, but we will still want stories.
That's right, and I actually believe that we are stories. That's the reason why we love narrative. We love books, we love movies, we love telling each other stories, anecdotes, jokes, because we are stories. Our very lives are stories. And that whole sort of hoary thing about everyone's got a story to tell, I actually would go a little bit further than that and say, well, everyone is a story, and everyone's a million stories. And you don't just have a story to tell, you have an incalculable number of stories to tell, because that's what you are. You're just a repository of stories. And maybe that's why we love books so much, because they remind us of ourselves. They are an extension of us in many ways. And yeah. And
stories are the way we make sense of things, the way we make sense of life. And that's why I'm very interested in the role of an artist during a time of crisis like the one we're going through. What do you think an artist's role is, Chris? When times are tough like this?
Yeah, I guess artists have been a little bit neglected of late, and I saw a thing the other day. It was talking about essential workers, and it was a list of the top 10 essential workers and a list of the top 10 non-essential workers, and number one on the list of non-essential workers was artists.
And writers seem to be even, there have been some grants made to the arts today, I think, but there's mention of performers and theatres and musicians, but no mention of writers.
No, that's right.
So we're at the bottom of the heap.
But how can we expect to make sense of any crisis that we face as a species if we're not allowed to write about it and think about it critically and tell stories about it. Every one of us watching tonight has got a story about what it's like to be living under COVID, or in a time of a pandemic, and in this sort of weird, crazy, insane year we've just had with bushfires and smoke over our cities and Black Lives Matter and COVID. I mean, there's a new story every day going on in our lives, and if we can't tell those stories, if we're denying artists the opportunity to tell those stories, then what's the point of being alive? You know, if we can't somehow parse what's happening in our lives into the written or the spoken form. The artist is arguably the most important person in the world right now, because what on earth are future generations going to think of this time, assuming there will be future generations, which of course there will be. What are they going to think of this time if we can't tell them what happened and how we felt?
I'd like to thank you too. It's been incredibly enlightening. It's been wonderful. As somebody said, it's been wonderful, stimulating and thought-provoking. So, but I'd also like to thank Brett Tessari, our wonderful mayor, for coming on. I wasn't ignoring, I knew you were there. I hope you enjoyed it, Brett. You've now been unmuted. So, and also to thank very much the Bass Coast Shire Council for their support with our program, which we've got 3 more to go. But thank you, Brett, and you might give me some feedback sometime.
I would love to, and thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, Helen. Just fantastic. I really, really did enjoy that a lot.
Oh, thanks, Brett. You're a good man.
And so I'd like to again thank everybody who booked and joined in, and I think it's been a wonderful discussion. And Chris's book is amazing. It teaches us a lot, and I think it'll be selling for quite a while, so which will be just wonderful. So thank you, everyone, and I think we might close up now, and we might see you for the next 3 events. Thank you.
It's worth pointing out, Lois, possibly that if people want to buy my book or Helen's books or anyone's books, that they can come to your bookshop in Cowes, turn the page and get it. And I see there's a few people in the comments there. Someone said they're doing a book club in Inverloch to discuss MAMMOTH.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, if those guys if they want to get in touch and want me to jump in their Zoom book club, which I did last night for the Yarra Valley, I'd be happy to jump in and have a little chat with the people reading the book.
Chris, if I could just for 2 seconds, I guess just let you know, I'm not sure whether you'd be aware or not, but we've been working very closely with Mike Cleland, and I'm sure everyone or most people here know Mike Cleland. And there's a real push now to the dinosaur trail that we have from Inverloch to, I think, San Remo. We're really pushing for some funding to progress that, and that'll be something special. So I'm sure you'd be interested in that.
Wow! Oh yeah, if you need any help with that, I'm definitely up for that.
Well done.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and good evening and good reading. Bye.